Welcome, traveler, to the misty world of ancient Celtic memory, where stories live not on parchment, but in the minds of specially trained keepers of tradition. Tonight, you'll journey back to a time between roughly 500 BCE and 500 CE across the green hills of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Gaul, where bards held entire libraries within their heads. Let yourself settle in as we explore the voices that shaped Celtic culture through nothing more than memory, music, and the human voice. The year is approximately 200 BCE, though you wouldn't measure time that way. You'd count it by generations, by the reigns of kings, by the great cattle raids that everyone still talks about. The smoke from the central hearth curls upward through the thatch, and you're watching a young boy, perhaps 13 winters old, sitting with his eyes closed, rocking slightly, murmuring words you can't quite hear. He's not praying. He's remembering. This boy is an apprentice bard, and right now, inside his head, he's building what you might think of as a memory palace, though that term won't be invented for centuries. He's taking a story about a cattle raid that happened before his grandfather was born, and hanging each piece of it on a mental landmark. The hero's name goes on the oak tree near the stream. The description of his shield hangs from the boulder shaped like a sitting dog. The insult that started the war lives in the hollow where the foxes den. You notice his fingers are tapping against his knee in a complex rhythm. 7 beats, pause, 5 beats, pause, 3 beats. The rhythm isn't just helping him remember, it is the memory, woven so tightly with the words that separating them would be like trying to take the wet out of water. The fire pops, sending up a small shower of sparks, and the boy doesn't even flinch. His concentration is absolute. You've seen people concentrate before, hunters tracking deer, craftsmen working silver. But this is different. This is someone building a structure entirely inside their own mind, a structure that has to be so solid, so permanent, that it can carry a 3-hour story without a single mistake, because there's no manuscript to check against. There's no rough draft. There's only the version in his head and the version in his teacher's head, and they'd better match exactly. The boy's teacher, an older man with a grey beard that reaches his chest, sits across the fire watching. He hasn't spoken in an hour. He won't interrupt. This particular story takes most of a day to tell properly, and the apprentice has been learning it for 6 months. Today is just one section, maybe 20 minutes worth, about how the hero acquired his horses. It's a small piece, but it connects to 12 other stories, and if you don't get the horses right, the battle 3 stories later makes no sense. You find yourself wondering what it would feel like to carry that much narrative weight in your head. You try to remember a story your grandmother told you once, and you can get the beginning, the rough shape of the middle, and definitely the ending. But the details have gone soft around the edges. You can't remember if the character had 2 brothers or 3. Was the treasure buried under an oak or an ash? Your version of the story has become streamlined, simplified, and worn smooth like a river stone. But that won't do for a bard. A bard's memory has to be sharp and specific, because the details aren't decorative, they're functional. The type of tree matters because it tells you what time of year it is. The number of brothers matters because it sets up the inheritance dispute that causes the next problem. The color of the horse matters because that specific horse appears again in a story that won't be told until tomorrow night. The Celtic peoples you're living among don't have a prohibition against writing exactly. They know writing exists. They trade with people who write things down. Greek merchants have been bringing amphorae of wine up the rivers for generations, and those amphorae have writing on them. But for the truly important things, the genealogies, the laws, the sacred stories, the praise poems that keep a king's reputation alive, writing seems dangerous, too fixed, too dead. A bard named Celtic once explained it to you this way: On a night much like this one, a written thing says the same words to everyone. But I can tell you the story of Kuroe and make it about honor if you need to hear about honor, or about the danger of jealousy if that's what's eating at you. The story doesn't change exactly. The bones stay the same, but the living flesh of it, the tone, the places where I pause, the details I choose to paint most vividly, that adjusts to who needs to hear it. You're watching The Apprentice and thinking about how lonely this kind of memory must be. If you forget something from your trade, how to mix a particular dye, the best moon phase for cutting thatch, you can ask someone. But if this boy forgets part of his story, he can't just ask anyone in the village. He has to go back to his teacher, and his teacher will know he forgot, and that failure will be noted. The pressure must be extraordinary, and yet the boy doesn't look stressed. His face has gone smooth and distant, almost peaceful. He's somewhere else entirely, living inside the story he's remembering, and you recognize that expression. You've seen it on musicians when they're deep in a complicated piece, on artists working on intricate knotwork. It's the look of someone whose whole mind is engaged with something difficult and doing it well. The teacher finally speaks, just 3 words. Good. Now backward. The boy opens his eyes, takes a breath, and begins to recite the same section in reverse order. Not the words backward, that would be pointless, but the events backward, working from the hero's acquisition of the horses back to the morning when he first decided he needed them. It's a different story in reverse, requires different verbal transitions, and the apprentice handles it smoothly. Proof that he doesn't just have the words memorized, but also the underlying structure, the logic of cause and effect that makes the narrative hold together. You settle back against the wattle wall of the roundhouse and close your eyes, listening to the backward story. Outside, you can hear the settlement quieting down for the night. A dog barks once, then falls silent. Someone's cooking pot clinks against stone. The eternal sounds of people settling in, getting comfortable, and preparing for sleep. Inside your own head, you try to imagine carrying 100 stories this way, or 200, or 500. The scope of it makes you dizzy. These bards are living libraries and walking archives, and they move through the world with all that narrative weight balanced perfectly in their minds, ready to pull out the right story at the right moment to entertain, to teach, and to preserve the memory of people who would otherwise vanish completely. The smoke drifts, the fire settles. The apprentice reaches the beginning of the backward story, and his teacher nods once, satisfied. Tomorrow, they'll do it again, and the day after that, and for months more, until the story is so embedded in the boy's memory that he could recite it while walking, while eating, or while half asleep, until it becomes as much a part of him as his own name. You're at a tribal gathering now, a few years later, watching 3 different bards work the crowd. It's helping you understand that bard isn't really one job. It's 3, maybe 4, depending on how finely you want to split the categories. The cultures across Celtic lands don't always use the same exact terms, but the roles are remarkably consistent, and tonight you can see all of them in action. Over by the high table, there's a man in his 50s with an elaborately pinned cloak fastened with a bronze brooch that probably cost more than most people's houses. This is a proper bard in the formal sense, what some tribes call a filly in Ireland, or a bard in the British territories. He's the top tier, the one who studied for 20 years, who knows the deep genealogies and the secret mythologies and the praise poems that can make or break a king's reputation. Right now, he's not performing. He's eating venison and discussing something with the king in a low voice. Something about a boundary dispute with a neighboring tribe. You can't hear the details, but you can see the king listening intently, nodding, and occasionally asking a question. The bard's role here isn't entertainment, it's counsel. He knows the genealogies of both tribes going back 15 generations. He knows which families married into which other families, and he knows the stories of how similar disputes were settled 3 generations ago. He's a walking legal library, and the king treats him accordingly. The pay for a top bard like this is substantial. He likely has his own land grant, cattle, exemption from certain taxes, and the right to a specific seat at every gathering. He dresses well. That cloak is dyed in a blue that takes considerable expense to produce, and he carries himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knows the king needs him more than he needs the king. After all, kings come and go, but the bard carries the legitimacy of lineage. No king rules without the blessing of the past, and it's the bard who controls access to that past. Down near the fire, there's a younger man with a small harp, taking requests and telling stories that get people laughing. This is a different kind of bard entirely, still trained, still skilled, but operating in a more popular register. He knows hundreds of stories, but they're shorter, punchier, and more immediately entertaining. He's just finished a tale about a farmer who tried to impress a girl by claiming he could speak to animals, which predictably went wrong in increasingly absurd ways. The crowd loved it. This bard makes his living differently. He doesn't have land grants or a permanent seat at court. Instead, he travels from settlement to settlement, getting fed and housed in exchange for entertainment, and collecting small gifts: a bronze ring, a measure of grain, a young pig. He's not poor by any means. A good traveling bard can accumulate wealth, and you notice he's wearing silver at his wrists. But his authority is different. He influences through popularity rather than through formal political power. You watch him transition from the funny story to something else, a tale about a hero from local legend fighting off raiders from across the water. His voice shifts, becomes more serious, and the crowd settles into a different kind of attention. He's reminding them of their courage, of their tribal identity, and of the strength of their ancestors. It's still entertainment, but it's doing cultural work, keeping the community's sense of itself alive. And then there's the satirist. She's standing near the edge of the gathering, and yes, she's a woman, which is more common in satire than in the formal praise poetry. She's young, maybe 25, and she's engaged in a verbal sparring match with a local warrior who apparently boasted about his prowess in last month's cattle raid. The problem is, several people were at that cattle raid, and her version of events is somewhat different from his. So when you single-handedly held the ford, were the other 6 warriors just there for decoration? She asks, her voice carrying across the crowd. People laugh. The warrior's face reddens. I was at the center of the defense, he insists. Oh, absolutely, she agrees, her voice sweet as honey and twice as dangerous. Right in the center, behind Khan and Dara. And Fiatra's quite large, so he probably blocked most of the action from your view. The warrior knows he's beaten. If he keeps arguing, she'll just get sharper. And the story she's telling, the true story, in which he was brave enough but not particularly exceptional, will become the one everyone remembers. He laughs it off, raises his cup in acknowledgement, and the satirist moves on. You understand, watching this, that satire in Celtic culture isn't just mockery. It's a form of social regulation. The satirist keeps people honest, punctures pretension, and prevents the kind of boasting that can tear communities apart. A good satirist is valued because they maintain balance, and they do it with words sharp enough to draw blood without spilling a drop. The evening wears on. The formal bard finishes his consultation with the king and performs a relatively short praise poem, only about 15 minutes, commemorating the king's father. It's dense with allusions that you don't all catch, references to battles and diplomatic marriages and cattle tributes. but the structure is beautiful, full of internal rhymes and repeated sounds that make it as much music as meaning. The traveling bard performs a much longer piece, a full story about an ancient king and a magical cauldron, complete with different voices for different characters and sound effects, created with just his voice and the rhythmic tapping of his hand against his harp. Children are sprawled around him, utterly absorbed, and you notice that even the adults have gone quiet. The satirist performs a piece she's composed for the occasion, a gentle roasting of the entire gathering, calling out various people's quirks and habits in a way that's pointed enough to be funny, but not so vicious that anyone actually feels attacked. Well, not most people. One older man looks distinctly uncomfortable when she mentions his habit of falling asleep during long meetings, but even he manages a grudging smile. What strikes you most is how all three of these bards are working from memory. The formal bard's 15-minute praise poem was performed without a single hesitation, every sound and syllable in its exact place. The traveling bard's hour-long story came out as smoothly as if he were reading it, but there was nothing to read from. The satirist's composition was clearly improvised in structure, but built on memorized elements, stock phrases, traditional insults, and rhythmic patterns she's learned so thoroughly she can deploy them without thinking. You lean back against a post and watch the fire burn lower. The formal bard is talking quietly with a group of elders now, probably discussing some fine point of genealogy. The traveling bard has pulled out his harp again and is playing something soft and contemplative, no longer the center of attention, but providing a musical backdrop to conversation. The satirist is sharing a drink with the warrior she roasted earlier, and they're both laughing. Different roles, different status, different pay grades, but all of them carrying the culture forward through memory and performance, keeping the stories alive and maintaining the continuity of identity and meaning that holds these people together as a tribe. You're following a young woman named Brig through her training now, year by year, and you're beginning to understand why becoming a proper bard takes so long. She started when she was 8 years old, and she's now 16, and her teacher says she's barely half finished. The first 3 years were mostly about attention, learning to sit still for hours, learning to listen so carefully that you could repeat back a 10-minute story after hearing it once, learning to notice details, the way someone's voice dropped when they mentioned a particular name, the gesture that accompanied a specific type of description, and the pause that gave weight to a reveal. Brig's teacher would make her watch people at the market and then describe them later in vivid detail. Not just a tall man, but the specific way his weight settled into his left hip, suggesting an old injury. Not just a woman selling herbs, but which herbs, how she sorted them, and the pattern of stains on her fingers that told you what she'd been processing that morning. You remember Brig at 10 years old, frustrated to tears because she couldn't remember the difference between two similar stories about boundary disputes, and her teacher explaining patiently that the details mattered. In one story, the disputed territory had 3 standing stones. In the other, it had 2 standing stones and an ancient oak. Those landmarks meant different places, different families, and different legal precedents. Get them confused, and you weren't just telling a story wrong. You were potentially giving bad counsel that could lead to real disputes, maybe even violence. The middle years, 11 to 14, were about memorization in earnest. Brig learned genealogies until she could recite the lineages of every major family in 3 neighboring kingdoms. She learned the catalogue of famous battles, famous cattle raids, and famous single combats. She learned praise poetry for about 24 different kings, most of them long dead, because you had to know the old forms before you could compose new ones. But the memorization wasn't rote. Each genealogy is connected to stories. Each battle had its own narrative with heroes and cowards, clever tactics and stupid mistakes, and glory and tragedy. The cattle raids were linked to property disputes and old grievances and marriage alliances gone wrong. Everything was connected to everything else, and Brig had to learn not just the individual pieces, but the web of connections that made Celtic history a living, coherent thing, rather than a random collection of facts. You watched her learn the story of a great warrior, and then learn 3 other stories in which that warrior appeared as a minor character, and then learn the genealogy of his enemies, and then learn the praise poem his own bard composed after his death, and then learn the satire a rival bard composed, suggesting the whole heroic reputation was somewhat exaggerated. By the time she was finished, she didn't just know facts about this warrior. She understood his entire cultural context, could place him accurately in the complex web of Celtic tribal politics, and could tell his story in a way that explained why it mattered. Now, at 16, Brig is learning composition. She's studying the traditional meters and the permissible variations. She's learning how to build a praise poem that honors a patron without being so obviously flattering that it becomes empty. She's learning how to take current events, a recent border skirmish, a successful hunt, a marriage alliance, and shape them into narratives that will be worth remembering. You're sitting with her one afternoon as she works on a practice composition, and you can see the difficulty of it. She's trying to praise a local chief's generosity in hosting a feast, but she has to do it using a specific meter that requires each line to have 7 syllables with particular stress patterns, and she has to include at least 3 traditional metaphors for generosity, while also making it feel specific to this particular chief and this particular feast. No, wait. She scratches out a line drawn in the dirt with a stick. His hole. The hole opened wide. No, that's 8 syllables. She tries again and again. You can see her mentally counting on her fingers, muttering to herself, occasionally singing a line softly to hear how the rhythm works. After about half an hour, she gets one line that satisfies her. 4 down, she says. Only 16 to go. This particular composition is supposed to be 20 lines long, and it's taken her 3 days so far. When she's finally satisfied with it, she'll memorize it completely, so that if someone asks her in 10 years about that feast, she can recite the poem she composed with perfect recall, exactly as she crafted it. Her teacher is also making her learn instrumental music now, not just harp. That's the primary instrument, but also the wooden flute and the war horn and the singing techniques that let you project your voice across a crowded hall without screaming yourself hoarse. Music and poetry aren't separate arts in Celtic culture. They're woven together so tightly that the word for poet and the word for musician are sometimes used interchangeably. You watch Brig practice the harp one evening, working through a complex fingering pattern that will accompany a story about a sea voyage. The music is supposed to evoke the rhythm of waves, but it also has to stay steady enough that she can chant the story over it without getting thrown off. Her fingers are calloused now from years of practice, and they move with an efficiency that makes the difficult look easy. But you remember what those fingers looked like 2 years ago. Still soft, fumbling through the simplest melodies, and you appreciate the hours of work that have gone into making this look effortless. The hardest part of Brig's training, she tells you, isn't the memorization. It's learning to understand people. A bard has to read a room, has to know when to tell a funny story and when solemnity is required, and has to gauge the mood of a patron and deliver the kind of praise that will actually land rather than ring false. You can have perfect recall of 500 stories, but if you don't know which one to tell in a given moment, you're just a talking encyclopedia. Impressive, but not actually useful. Her teacher takes her to gatherings now, not to perform, but to observe. Afterward, they discuss what happened. Why did that other bard choose that particular story? What was the political subtext of praising this family's ancestry? Why did the satirist back off from that line of mockery when she did? Brig is learning that bardic performance is a form of social navigation, requiring constant attention and adjustment. The same story might be perfect at one gathering and completely wrong at another, depending on who's present, what tensions are simmering, and what alliances are being negotiated. She still has years to go. She needs to learn the sacred mythologies, the stories about the gods and the other world that are considered so important they're only taught to advanced students. She needs to spend time traveling with her teacher, visiting other tribes, learning local variations on stories, and building the network of connections that will sustain her career. She needs to compose her masterwork, the piece that will establish her reputation as a fully trained bard, rather than just a promising apprentice. But watching her work through that practice composition, hearing her mutter syllable counts and stress patterns to herself, seeing her face light up when she gets a line exactly right, you understand that this isn't just education, it's transformation. Brig is being shaped into a living vessel for culture, someone capable of carrying forward the accumulated wisdom and story and poetry of her people. The sun is setting now, and Brig has given up on composition for the day. She's playing her harp instead, just for pleasure, something simple and sweet that requires no thought. Her fingers dance across the strings, and the music drifts out across the settlement. Just another voice in the evening chorus of people finishing their work and settling towards sleep. You're in a great hall now, during winter, when the weather keeps people inside, and the nights are long enough for proper storytelling. The fire in the center of the hall burns bright, and around it, about 60 people have gathered. The chief's family, warriors, craftspeople, and farmers, everyone packed in close for warmth and entertainment. The bard tuning his harp near the fire is named Cillian, and you've heard him perform before. Tonight he's doing something you particularly love. He's telling a story with full musical accompaniment, and the music isn't just background. It's carrying meaning, adding layers to the narrative that words alone couldn't convey. He begins with just the harp, no words yet. The melody is simple, almost childlike, rising and falling in an uncomplicated pattern. People settle into listening positions, children sitting cross-legged near the front, adults leaning back against the walls or against each other, everyone's faces turned toward the firelight. Then Cillian begins to speak, his voice falling naturally into the rhythm of the harp. There was a king once, in the days when the old gods still walked visibly among us, and this king had everything a man could want. Cattle beyond counting, land stretching to the horizon, sons who were brave and daughters who were beautiful, and a wife who was wise. The music continues its simple pattern, peaceful and content, matching the description of prosperity. But the king was not happy. Here the music shifts, the same basic melody, but now there's a minor note creeping in, a slight dissonance that makes your ear prick up. Something's wrong, even though the words haven't quite said so yet. Cillian describes the king's growing restlessness, his sense that something is missing, and all the while, the harp is reinforcing this feeling, the melody beginning to circle without quite resolving, creating a musical itch that needs scratching. You find yourself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by the combination of voice and instrument. The king in the story decides to seek advice from a druid, and when Cillian speaks the druid's words, his voice drops to a different register, deeper and more resonant, while the harp shifts to slower, more solemn chords. You don't need to be told this is a wise figure speaking. The music tells you. The timbre of the voice tells you. Everything about the performance marks this as a moment of significance. What amazes you is how Cillian manages both the speaking and the playing simultaneously. The harp never stops, never falters, even as he's performing different voices, changing his tone and pausing for effect. His fingers have their own memory, continuing the musical pattern while his conscious attention focuses on the narrative. It's like watching someone juggle while also reciting poetry, two complex tasks running in parallel, neither one diminishing the other. The story develops, the king goes on a quest, and the music becomes more active and more rhythmic, suggesting movement and journey. When he faces a challenge, a river that can't be crossed, a riddle that must be solved, the music builds tension, the intervals becoming wider, the rhythm more insistent. When he succeeds, the melody resolves into something triumphant, and you feel yourself relax even before Cillian describes the success in words. There's a section where the king enters the other world, and here the music becomes genuinely strange. Cillian's fingers find notes that seem to shimmer, harmonics that sound almost like bells or like voices calling from a distance. The melody loses its grounding, floating in a way that makes the hair on your arms stand up. You're not in the normal world anymore, and the music is telling you so, creating a sense of otherworldliness that mere description could never achieve. A small child near the front looks frightened, and her mother pulls her close, murmuring reassurance. But the child can't look away from Cillian, and you understand. This is real for her. The music has transported her so completely that the other world feels present in the hall, dangerous and beautiful, and close enough to touch. When the king returns from his quest, successful and transformed, the music returns to something like its opening melody, but changed. It's the same notes, essentially, but played with more complexity, more confidence, and more depth. The king isn't the same as he was, and the music tells you so without a single word needing to explain it. You've heard other bards who aren't as skilled with the harp, and they tend to use music more simply, as punctuation between sections or as a steady background drone. But Cillian is using his instrument as a second voice, a parallel narrative that reinforces and enriches everything the words are doing. As the story reaches its conclusion, the king returning home, sharing the wisdom he's learned, bringing new understanding to his people, the music finally resolves completely, coming home to the key it started in, all the tension released. The last note rings out and fades slowly, and Cillian lets it fade completely before he speaks again. And that king ruled for 40 more years, he says simply, and he was happy. The hall is silent for a moment, everyone still caught in the spell of the story, and then someone begins to clap, and others join in, and soon the whole room is applauding and calling out appreciation. But Cillian isn't finished for the night. After a brief break, someone brings him ale, and he drinks deeply, giving his voice a rest. He begins another piece. This one is different, a collection of shorter tales linked by a common theme, and between each tale, he performs a purely instrumental interlude on the harp, no words at all. These musical interludes are their own kind of storytelling. One of them sounds like a storm, with rapid runs up and down the strings, suggesting rain, and heavy bass notes, suggesting thunder. Another sounds like a lullaby, so gentle and repetitive that you see several small children beginning to drowse. Another is martial and stirring, full of the rhythms that would accompany warriors marching to battle. You're struck by how music in Celtic culture isn't just entertainment. It's a language of its own, capable of expressing things that words struggle with. Emotions too subtle for naming, spiritual experiences too vast for description, and connections between ideas that logic can't quite bridge. The evening wears on, Cillian performs for perhaps 3 hours total, mixing stories and music, sometimes letting one dominate, sometimes blending them equally. Other people contribute too. Someone plays a wooden flute for a while, and a woman with a beautiful voice sings an old ballad without any instrumental accompaniment, her voice alone filling the hall with a tale of lost love and eventual reunion. Near midnight, the gathering begins to disperse. Children are carried off to bed, already asleep. Adults drift toward their own sleeping spaces, moving slowly, reluctant to break the spell of the evening. The fire burns lower, and someone adds more peat, and Cillian plays one last piece. Something quiet and meandering, more like thinking aloud than performing, his fingers finding their way through a melody without any apparent goal, just playing. Because the harp is in his hands, and the night is peaceful, and there's no reason to stop yet. You stay until the end, until Cillian finally puts the harp down and stretches, working the stiffness out of his shoulders. His fingers will be sore tomorrow. 3 hours of playing is hard work. But tonight he looks satisfied, the way someone looks after doing something they're genuinely good at, something that matters. The music lingers in your mind as you make your way to your own sleeping space. You find yourself humming one of the melodies, trying to remember how it went, how it made you feel. You can't quite recapture it. That's the nature of oral tradition. Nothing fixed, everything living. But the feeling remains, warm and complete, like coming home to a fire after a long walk in the cold. You're traveling with a bard named Donald through the tribal territory, and you're learning that certain stories belong to certain places. Not metaphorically, literally. There are stories you can only tell when you're standing in the right landscape, looking at the right landmarks, because the place itself is part of the narrative. Donald stops at the top of a hill overlooking a river valley. The morning sun is just starting to burn off the mist, and below you can see the river winding through green fields. There's a particular bend in the river where the water flows around a massive boulder, and Donald points to it. That's where Finan made his stand, he says. That's where this story happens. He settles himself on the grass, cross-legged, and begins to tell a story about a cattle raid. And you realize quickly that the landscape is doing some of the storytelling for him. He doesn't have to describe the hill in detail. You're standing on it. He doesn't have to explain how far the raiders could see. You can look across the valley and understand it yourself. When he talks about Finan choosing to defend the boulder rather than the ford upstream, you can see both positions and understand why one was better than the other. The story changes because you're in the place where it happened. It becomes more vivid, more real, and more connected to something physical and permanent. You can imagine Finan standing exactly where that boulder stands, making his choice, and the land itself vouches for the truth of the story in a way that words alone never could. Donald finishes the tale, and you continue walking. He tells you that he learned this story from his teacher, who learned it from her teacher, who learned it from someone who actually knew Finan's grandson. The chain of transmission goes back almost to the event itself, and part of what's been transmitted is the knowledge that this story belongs to this place. If I told you this story while we were somewhere else, Donald explains, it would just be a story. But here, with the land to witness it, it becomes history. You pass through a forest, and near a clearing, Donald stops again. This time the story is older, more mythological. It's about one of the gods, Lug, the many-skilled one, and it involves a challenge, a transformation, and a lesson about humility. But what makes it powerful is that Donald tells you to look at a specific tree, an ancient oak that must be hundreds of years old, and he says, that's the tree where it happened. Probably it isn't, not literally. Probably the original tree, if there even was one, is long dead. But the story has become attached to this tree, And now this tree serves as an anchor point for the narrative, a physical reminder of the story's presence in the world. You meet people as you travel, and many of them know Donald's stories, or versions of them. A farmer mentions the tale about Finan at the boulder, and his version is slightly different from Donald's. In his telling, Finan had 4 warriors with him instead of 3, and the fight lasted into the next day. Donald doesn't correct him. This isn't about perfect accuracy, it's about living tradition, and different tellers emphasize different aspects depending on what matters to their audience. But the boulder remains the boulder. The landscape doesn't change, and as long as that landmark exists, the story has a home, a physical location in the world that keeps it from floating away into complete abstraction. You climb another hill, this one with a cluster of standing stones near the summit. These stones are old, nobody knows exactly how old, and they're covered with lichen and worn smooth by weather. Donald doesn't tell a story here. Instead, he sings. It's a praise poem for the sun, full of metaphors comparing the sun to gold, to a wheel of fire, and to the eye of heaven. And as he sings it, the morning light hits the standing stones in a way that makes them glow, briefly, their gray surfaces turning warm and golden. The song belongs here, he explains later. It's a dawn song, meant to be performed on hilltops as the sun rises, and while you could sing it anywhere, it's supposed to be sung inside of these stones, or stones like them, places where the barrier between the ordinary world and the other world grows thin. You begin to understand that the Celtic landscape is saturated with story. Every river has its tales, every mountain has its legends, every unusual rock formation or ancient tree is potentially the setting for a narrative. The bards move through this story-soaked landscape like guides, knowing which tales connect to which places, keeping the relationship between land and narrative alive. Some places have multiple stories attached to them, layers of narrative built up over generations. There's a well you visit where Donald knows at least 7 different stories. 3 about saints who blessed the water, 2 about heroes who drank from it before battle, 1 about a woman who found treasure nearby, and 1 about a supernatural creature that supposedly guards it. He doesn't tell all 7. He chooses the one about the warrior going to battle because you're traveling with a young man who's about to join his first cattle raid, and that's the story that will mean something to him right now. The stories aren't just decorating the landscape, they're teaching people how to read it. When Donald tells you about a particular valley being cursed because of an ancient betrayal, he's not just entertaining you, he's explaining why nobody tries to farm there, why the grass always seems sparse, and why travelers avoid it after dark. The story functions as practical information wrapped in narrative form. You camp one night beside a lake, and as the sun sets, turning the water bronze, and then silver, and then black, Donald tells a story about a city that once stood here, drowned by the gods as punishment for some long-forgotten transgression. You know it's probably not literally true. Lakes don't work that way. But as you look out across the dark water, you feel the story settling into the landscape, becoming part of how you'll remember this place. And that's exactly what's supposed to happen. The story is a way of marking the place in memory, of making it significant, of ensuring that people remember it, and perhaps remember to be cautious around deep water, and to think about the consequences of hubris. The next morning you continue walking, and you realize that every place you pass has already been marked by story, has already been made meaningful by the narratives that cling to it like morning mist. Donald knows hundreds of these place-based tales, and there are bards all across the Celtic lands who know hundreds more, each one tying a piece of narrative to a piece of landscape, creating a web of meaning that covers the entire territory. When you finally return to the settlement, you look at it differently. That old oak near the chief's hall, what stories belong to it? That stream running past the cattle pens, what tales have been told about it? The land is no longer neutral ground. It's alive with narrative, thick with stories that have nowhere else to live except in the memories of the bards and the permanence of the landscape itself. You're observing a legal dispute now, watching how bards function not just as entertainers but as living law books. Two families are arguing over the ownership of a cow, a valuable animal, well bred, and the pride of someone's herd, until its ownership became confused during a complicated series of trades and marriages. The chief could simply make a decision, but instead he's called for the bard, because the bard knows the legal precedents, knows the genealogies of both families, and knows what happened in similar disputes going back generations. The bard's name is Seosam, and he's elderly, perhaps 70, walking with a stick but still sharp-minded and commanding respect. Seosam listens to both sides of the dispute. He asks questions about the cow's mother, about the trades that were made, and about the marriages that complicated the ownership. People keep trying to simplify things, to just state their claim, but he makes them slow down and makes them give details because the details matter. Then he sits silent for a long moment, thinking. Everyone waits. Finally, he begins to speak, and what he says isn't a judgment, it's a story. He tells them about a similar dispute 3 generations ago, during the time of the chief's grandfather. Different families, different cows, but the circumstances were remarkably parallel. A valuable animal, a series of trades, and a marriage that created confusion about ownership. He recites the details of that older case with absolute precision, the names of the people involved, the exact nature of the trades, and the decision that was made. In that older case, the cow went to the family that could prove they'd provided fodder for it through the winter. The logic was that whoever bore the cost of keeping the animal alive had demonstrated ownership through action, not just words. Seosam stops speaking and looks at the two families. Everyone understands what he's done. He hasn't made the decision. The chief will still do that. But he's provided the legal precedent, the traditional framework for thinking about this kind of problem. He's essentially said, here's how we've handled this before. Here's what our ancestors considered important. The chief asks both families about fodder. Turns out one family can prove they fed the cow through the recent winter, and the other cannot. The decision becomes obvious. The cow goes to the family that provided the fodder, and nobody can complain that the judgment was arbitrary or unfair, because it follows tradition, follows precedent, and follows the wisdom of previous generations. You realize that this is a huge part of what bards do. They're not just remembering stories for entertainment. They're remembering the entire legal and ethical framework of their society. Without writing, without law books, without any external reference, the bard's memory is what keeps the legal system consistent and fair. Later, you ask Seosama how many legal precedents he knows. He thinks for a moment, then shrugs. Impossible to count, he says. 100, 200, they overlap, you understand? The same precedent might apply to disputes about cattle or land boundaries or marriage contracts, depending on the specifics. He explains that learning legal precedents was one of the hardest parts of his training. Entertainment stories have natural hooks. They're exciting, memorable, and full of vivid details. But legal precedents are often dry, focused on technical details rather than emotional impact. You have to memorize them carefully and understand not just what was decided, but why, so you can apply the reasoning to new situations that your ancestors never imagined. That afternoon, you watch Seosam perform a different function. He composes and performs a praise poem for the chief. This is a public event, performed in the Great Hall with most of the settlement in attendance, because praise poetry is serious business in Celtic culture. The poem Seosam has composed is about 20 minutes long, and it's dense with allusion and metaphor. He praises the chief's generosity, comparing him to legendary gift-givers of the past. He praises the chief's justice, referencing specific decisions the chief has made and comparing them to wise judgments from history. He praises the chief's courage, mentioning a border skirmish from last year and comparing the chief's tactical decisions to those of famous warriors. What you notice is that Seosam is doing more than just flattering the chief. He's defining what the chief is supposed to be, holding up an ideal and suggesting that the chief is meeting it. The praise isn't just "you're wonderful," it's "you're wonderful in these specific ways, for these specific reasons, and here's how you compare to the great leaders of the past." And there's an implied threat in this, which everyone in the hall understands. Seosam can compose praise poetry, but he can also compose satire. If the chief starts failing to live up to these ideals, if he becomes stingy instead of generous, unjust instead of fair, cowardly instead of brave, Seosama could compose a poem that says so, and that poem would damage the chief's reputation far more effectively than any direct criticism. Bards have destroyed rulers this way. You've heard stories about it. A king who offended a bard and found himself the subject of a devastating satire that spread across the entire territory. Within a year, the king's authority was undermined so completely that he had to step down. Words, it turns out, are as powerful as swords, and sometimes more so. The praise poem finishes, and the chief gives Seosam a generous gift, a fine cloak and a silver brooch. This isn't optional. A chief who receives a praise poem and doesn't reward it appropriately will quickly find that no bard wants to praise him. And a chief without bardic support is a chief whose legitimacy is in question. You spend the evening thinking about the relationship between bards and political power. The bards aren't rulers, but they're not exactly subordinate either. They exist in a strange position, both inside and outside the political hierarchy, essential to it but also capable of criticizing it, supporting it, but also holding it accountable. A young bard in training asks Seosam about this later, and he answers carefully. A chief has power over things, land, cattle, people. A bard has power over meaning. We decide what gets remembered and how it gets remembered. We shape reputation. We define what counts as honorable or shameful. That's not the same as political power, but it's not nothing either. He pauses, staring into the fire. The trick is to use that power responsibly, to remember that we serve the truth, not just whoever's paying us, to preserve what deserves preserving, and to critique what deserves critique. It's a difficult balance, and not every bard manages it. The fire pops, sending up sparks, and you watch them rise and fade. You're thinking about how much trust has been placed in these bards, these walking repositories of lore and story and praise and satire. The entire structure of Celtic society depends on them being honest, being accurate, and being willing to speak truth, even when it's inconvenient. And mostly, it seems, they are. The system works. Not perfectly, nothing works perfectly, but well enough that people trust it, well enough that disputes get resolved and leaders get held accountable, and the culture sustains itself generation after generation without any need for written contracts or codified laws or external authority. Everything runs on memory, reputation, and the shared agreement that the bards are trustworthy keepers of tradition. You're spending a winter in a great hall, watching how the rhythm of communal life shapes and is shaped by bardic performance. This is where oral tradition really lives, not in formal performances at great gatherings, but in the everyday flow of story and song that fills the long dark evenings when there's nothing to do but sit by the fire and entertain each other. The hall belongs to a minor chief named Cathal, and it houses his extended family, about 40 people in total, plus occasional visitors. During the day, people are out doing whatever work needs doing, tending animals, repairing equipment, processing food, and crafting tools. But when the sun sets early in these winter months, everyone gathers inside around the central hearth, and the evening entertainment begins. It's not always formal. Often it starts with someone just talking, remembering something funny that happened last summer, mentioning an ancestor, making a casual reference to an old story, and then someone else picks up the thread, adds to it, corrects a detail, and before you know it, a full narrative is unfolding, collaboratively constructed by whoever feels like contributing. You watch a story about Cathal's great-grandfather emerge this way. Someone mentions that the old man once walked all the way to the coast, a journey of 3 days, to see the ocean, which he'd never seen before. Someone else remembers that he brought back salt, a valuable commodity. A third person adds that he nearly died on the way back when a storm caught him in the hills. A fourth person corrects this. It wasn't a storm, it was a fever, and he recovered because a hermit gave him medicine. The story comes together like a puzzle, each person contributing the pieces they remember or were told. And by the end, you have a complete narrative about an old man's journey to the sea. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody planned to tell it tonight. It just emerged from the collective memory of the group. And now it's been refreshed in everyone's mind, ready to be told again when the next person mentions their great-grandfather. The hall has a resident bard named Aithne, but she doesn't monopolize the entertainment. She contributes, certainly. She tells longer, more polished stories, and she plays the harp for dances and accompaniment. But she's one voice among many. Children tell simple stories they've learned. Young adults practice their developing skills. Elders share memories. Aithne's role is partly to perform and partly to curate, to keep the tradition healthy by teaching new stories, correcting errors, and preserving the most important narratives against the erosion of casual retelling. You notice that certain stories get told more often than others. The funny ones, for instance. There's a tale about a warrior who got drunk and challenged a tree to single combat, and that story gets retold at least once a week, always to laughter, because it's genuinely funny, and because it makes a point about the dignity-destroying power of too much ale. The moral stories also get frequent airtime. Tales about people who were generous and were rewarded, or people who were stingy and suffered for it. These aren't heavy-handed fables. They're presented as entertainment, but everyone understands the underlying message, and you see parents catching their children's eyes during certain parts, making sure the lesson lands. The long epics get told less frequently, simply because they take so much time. But there's a rhythm to it. About once a month, Aithne will announce that she's going to tell a major story, something that will take most of the evening, and people prepare for it. The smaller children get put to bed early. People finish their handwork quickly, so they can give their full attention. Someone makes sure there's extra peat for the fire, because letting it die mid-story would be disastrous. These long storytelling nights are social events as much as entertainment. People arrange themselves carefully. Families clustered together, young couples finding excuses to sit near each other, and the elderly claiming the best spots close to the fire. Someone always asks Aithne what story she's telling, and she always refuses to say, building anticipation. Tonight she's chosen a major hero tale, something about a young warrior's first great battle. She starts slowly, setting the scene and introducing the characters, and you can feel the hall settling into the story's rhythm. For the next 3 hours, nothing else will matter. The work of the day is forgotten. The weather outside is irrelevant. There's only the story, the fire, and the voice of the bard bringing it all to life. About halfway through, someone brings Eithne a cup of ale, and she pauses, drinks, clears her throat, and continues. It's a practiced transition, so smooth that it barely interrupts the narrative flow. She's done this 1,000 times and knows exactly how to pace herself and how to use a drink break to build suspense or to mark a major transition in the story. The children who weren't sent to bed are fighting sleep, determined to hear the ending. A girl of perhaps 8 is leaning against her mother, eyes half closed. But whenever Eithne raises her voice for an exciting moment, the girl's eyes snap open, wide with attention. She'll remember this, you think. 20 years from now, she'll remember the night she heard this story, the warmth of the fire, the sound of Eithne's voice, and the feeling of her mother's arm around her shoulders. The story reaches its climax. The young warrior faces his greatest challenge, and Eithne's voice rises, her words coming faster, the harp in her lap adding urgent rhythms. Then the moment of victory, and her voice softens, slows, and brings everything back down to resolution and peace. The hero returns home. The battle is won. The tribe is safe. She plays a final chord on the harp and lets it fade completely before anyone moves or speaks. Then, quietly at first but growing, applause and appreciation. Someone whistles. Someone else calls out, "Well told." Eithne nods, accepting the praise, and reaches for her ale again, this time to actually quench her thirst rather than for dramatic pause. The hall doesn't disperse immediately. People need time to come back from the story, to reorient to the ordinary world. Small conversations start up, comments on the story, discussions of favorite moments, comparisons to other versions they've heard. Eithne participates in these conversations, answering questions, clarifying details, and sometimes revealing bits of the story's history or variations she's heard from other bards. You realize that this is how oral tradition maintains itself, not just through formal performance, but through this constant engagement with stories, this ongoing conversation about them, and this regular refreshing of the collective memory. The hall is a kind of living library, and every evening is a chance to check out a different volume, to share it with the group, and to ensure it doesn't get forgotten. As people finally begin to drift toward their sleeping spaces, you hear a young boy asking his father about part of the story he didn't understand. The father explains patiently, relating it to something the boy already knows, helping him fit this new story into his growing understanding of his culture's narrative world. This, you think, is how it works. This is how stories stay alive without writing. The hall provides the space. The bard provides the expertise. The community provides the attention and the collective memory. And together, they keep the culture alive, passing it forward one story at a time, one evening at a time, year after year, generation after generation. You're sitting with an aging bard named Breck, and he's telling you about the stories that are dying, the ones that won't survive his generation. It's a melancholy conversation, but he's matter-of-fact about it, not sentimental. Every bard carries some stories that nobody else remembers, he explains. Either you learned something rare that didn't get passed on, or you're the last person who cares about a particular tale, or the story was always minor and there just aren't enough young bards interested in learning every minor thing. He tells you about a story he knows, a fairly long narrative about a dispute over fishing rights on a particular stretch of river. It's interesting enough, with good character development and a clever resolution, but it's also intensely local, relevant only to people who live near that specific river. Breck learned it 40 years ago from a bard who lived in that region, but he doesn't live there anymore, and none of his students have shown interest in learning it. When I die, Breck says. That story probably dies with me. Maybe someone else knows it, but if they do, I haven't met them in 20 years. You ask if this bothers him, and he shrugs. That's how oral tradition works. Not everything survives. Not everything should. Stories are like plants. The ones that serve a purpose keep growing, keep spreading. The ones that stop being useful eventually wither. That's natural. But then he contradicts himself slightly, adding, though I admit, there are a few stories I wish I could ensure survive. Not the fishing rights one. That can go. But there's a story about how Brigid taught the first healing. Well, you haven't earned that story yet. You learn that some stories are restricted, shared only with advanced students, or with people who have demonstrated they'll treat them properly. These are often sacred stories, mythologies about the gods, or narratives that contain what might be called trade secrets, medicinal knowledge, strategic insights, and dangerous information. Breck has stories he's never told publicly, and will never tell publicly because they're not for public consumption. They're for initiates only, for people who have studied long enough to understand the context and the responsibility that comes with knowing certain things. The gods' stories aren't entertainment, he says. They're keys to understanding the world, and you don't hand keys to children. You wait until someone's ready. This makes you think about all the stories that must have been lost over the centuries. When a bard died unexpectedly, without having fully trained a successor, what went with them? When a tribe was wiped out in war or disease, what narratives vanished entirely? When social changes made certain stories irrelevant, how many just faded quietly away? Breck acknowledges all of this. We lose things, he admits. Every generation loses something. But we also create new stories, adapt old ones, and keep the tradition alive even as it changes. That's the trade-off. Oral tradition is living tradition. It grows and changes. And yes, sometimes that means death as well as birth. You ask about stories that were considered true once, but that everyone now knows are exaggerated or wrong. Breck laughs. Oh, plenty of those. There's a story about an ancient king who supposedly lived to be 200 years old. Nobody believes that anymore, but we still tell the story because it's not really about the number. It's about the fact that his reign was so influential, it felt like multiple lifetimes. The truth of the story, in other words, isn't always literal. Sometimes it's metaphorical, emotional, or cultural. A story can be true in the sense of capturing something real about human experience, even if the specific details are impossible or exaggerated. Breck tells you about a story that he knows has changed significantly over the generations. It's about a battle, and when he learned it, the hero died gloriously in single combat. But he's heard older versions where the hero actually survived and lived to old age. Somewhere along the way, someone decided the story was better with a heroic death, and that version caught on, replacing the older one. Is that corruption of the tradition or evolution of it? Breck asks rhetorically. I honestly don't know. The new version is more satisfying dramatically and more useful for teaching about courage. But it's not what actually happened. Assuming anything in the story actually happened, which is debatable to begin with. He's remarkably untroubled by this ambiguity. For Breck, the purpose of stories isn't always historical accuracy. It's cultural transmission, moral education, entertainment, and identity formation. If a story serves those purposes, it's doing its job, regardless of whether every detail is factual. But there are some stories where accuracy matters enormously, and those are guarded more carefully. Legal precedents, for instance, genealogies, treaties and agreements. These stories have real-world consequences, and if they drift too far from accuracy, people get hurt. That's where writing would be useful, Breck admits. For contracts, for treaties, for things that absolutely must be remembered exactly. But we don't have it, so we compensate. We have multiple bards memorize the same legal precedent. We recite them regularly to keep them fresh. We check each other's versions to make sure they haven't drifted. He pauses, then adds, and even so, we probably get things wrong sometimes. That's the risk. You sit in silence for a while, thinking about the fragility of all this. An entire culture's memory residing in human brains, vulnerable to death, to forgetfulness, and to the slow erosion of time. And yet it works. The system has been functioning for centuries, maybe millennia, sustaining complex societies without any external memory storage at all. Breck seems to read your thoughts. It seems impossible until you realize that this is how humans lived for most of history. Writing is the anomaly, not oral tradition. We're built for this, for remembering stories, for learning from listening, for passing knowledge forward through voice and memory. It's only in recent times that we've started relying on external storage, and I'm not convinced we've gained more than we've lost. He catches himself. Well, no, that's not fair. Writing has its advantages, but it has costs too. A written story is dead. It says the same thing to everyone, forever. An oral story is alive. It adapts, it responds, and it changes with the needs of the people hearing it. You wonder aloud what will happen when writing becomes more common, when the Celtic peoples start recording their stories in script. Breck shrugs. Some things will be gained. Some will be lost. That's always how it goes. The sun is setting, and you need to get back to the settlement. As you stand to leave, Breck says one more thing. The stories that never get written down aren't gone. They're just not written. They live differently, in memory, in performance, in the land itself. That's not oblivion. That's a different kind of immortality. You're watching the Celtic world change, seeing how oral tradition adapts or fails to adapt to new circumstances. The Romans are expanding their territory. Christianity is spreading. Writing is becoming more common, and the bards are having to figure out what role they play in this shifting landscape. Some bards are hostile to writing. You've heard passionate arguments about how writing will destroy genuine memory, how it will make people lazy, and how the living tradition will become a dead letter. These bards refuse to learn to read or write, insisting that the old ways are superior and that nothing essential should be trusted to parchment. Other bards are more pragmatic. They see writing as a tool, neither inherently good nor bad. A few have even learned to write in Latin or Ogham script, and they're beginning to record some stories, though selectively, usually the ones that are already changing too much, or the ones they're worried about losing entirely. You meet a bard named Finea, who has learned to write, and she shows you some of her work. A manuscript where she's recorded 3 genealogies and a legal precedent about land inheritance. The writing is painstaking, each letter carefully formed, and she admits it took her months to complete these few pages. It's not the same as oral performance, she says. The story on the page is flat, lifeless, but at least it won't be forgotten if I die before I find the right student to pass it to. She's conflicted about this, you can tell. Part of her feels like she's betraying the tradition by writing it down. Part of her feels like she's preserving it in the only way that will work in the changing world. She doesn't know which instinct is right. The arrival of Christianity is particularly complex for bardic tradition. The Christian monks have their own stories, their own sacred narratives, and they're writing them down in beautiful illustrated manuscripts. Some of the old stories, especially the ones about the gods, are being deprecated as pagan superstition. But interestingly, the monks are also preserving some Celtic stories, recording them in Latin or Irish script because they recognize their literary value even when they don't believe in their religious content. It's an odd kind of rescue. The stories survive, but they're frozen in writing, unable to adapt and change as they would in pure oral tradition. You watch a young monk named Coleman working on a manuscript, recording the story of Cu Chulainn. He's trying to be faithful to the oral version he heard, but he's also editing as he goes, removing references that seem too pagan, adding Christian moral commentary, and reshaping the narrative to fit Christian sensibilities. The result is something hybrid, neither purely Celtic nor purely Christian. Some bards are furious about this. Others are grateful that at least the bones of the stories will survive. The community is fracturing between those who want to preserve tradition exactly as it was, and those who recognize that some adaptation is necessary for survival. You attend a gathering where this tension erupts into open conflict. An older bard named Aed is arguing passionately against accommodation with the new order. If we change the stories to please the monks, we lose what makes them ours, he insists. Better to let them die as they are than to preserve corrupted versions. A younger bard named Orla argues the opposite position. Stories that no one tells are already dead. If adapting them, keeping the essential narrative while adjusting the framing, means they survive for another generation, isn't that better than losing them entirely? The debate grows heated. Personal attacks get thrown. Old rivalries surface. In the end, nothing is resolved because nothing can be resolved. Different bards will make different choices, and the tradition will split into multiple streams, some stubbornly resistant to change, some pragmatically adaptive, and some actively collaborating with the new Christian culture. You find the whole situation poignant. These bards have spent their lives memorizing stories, perfecting their craft, and serving as the living memory of their people. And now they're watching their world transform in ways that make their skills less essential, less valued, and less viable as a way of life. Some bards are finding new roles. They're becoming scribes, using their memory and linguistic skills to help with administrative work for chiefs or monasteries. They're becoming teachers of history rather than performers of it. They're adapting, surviving, but they're no longer quite what they were. Others are retreating into increasingly isolated communities, trying to maintain the old ways in pockets of resistance against the tide of change. You visit one such community, a group of about 20 people living in a remote valley, deliberately avoiding contact with the Christianized towns, keeping the old festivals, and telling the old stories exactly as they've always been told. It's beautiful and sad at the same time. The dedication is real, the skill is impressive, but there's also something desperate about it, an attempt to stop time that can't ultimately succeed. The children in this community are learning the old stories, yes, but they're also curious about the world outside, and you suspect many of them will eventually leave. The hardest part is watching stories get forgotten, not because no one bothered to remember them, but because the contexts that made them meaningful have disappeared. There's a whole category of stories about relationships between humans and gods, rituals for honoring the deities, sacred sites, and their mythological significance. As Christianity becomes dominant, these stories become increasingly dangerous to tell, and gradually they fade. You watch a bard deliberately forget a story about Lugh, refusing to teach it to his students because he's converted to Christianity and considers it inappropriate. The story isn't lost entirely. Other bards still know it, but this particular thread of transmission breaks, and something is lost in that breaking. But there's also adaptation that feels successful, generative rather than corrupting. You hear a bard tell a story that's clearly ancient, something about a hero's journey and a magical transformation. But she's framed it now as an allegory about Christian conversion, and it works. The story survives in a new form, speaking to a new audience, still carrying some essential truth, even though the religious packaging has changed. And some stories are proving remarkably resilient, surviving almost unchanged, even in the new world. The hero tales, the historical battles, the funny stories about human folly, these don't depend on specific religious frameworks, and they're continuing to be told much as they always were, just in different venues and contexts. You end up thinking that oral tradition is more flexible than either its defenders or its critics give it credit for. It's changing, certainly, but it's been changing all along. That's what living tradition means. The question isn't whether it will change, but whether the changes will preserve what's essential or destroy it. Nobody knows the answer yet. The transformation is still happening, still unfolding, and it won't be clear for generations what survived and what was lost. You're in a village 3 centuries later, and the professional bards are mostly gone, but their stories remain, transformed, fragmented, and democratized into folklore. The stories that once required years of training to learn properly are now told by grandmothers and farmers and craftspeople, simplified and localized, but still recognizably descended from the old tradition. You're listening to an old woman tell her grandchildren a story, and you recognize the bones of it. It's a hero tale you heard a trained bard perform 200 years ago. But this version is much shorter and much simpler. The hero's complex genealogy is gone. The political context is missing. The story has been worn smooth by generations of casual retelling, keeping only the most memorable parts. The hero's cleverness, the monster he defeated, and the happy ending. It's not worse exactly, it's different. The old bardic version was rich and complex, full of connections to other stories, and carefully balanced in its pacing and structure. This version is direct and accessible, told in simple language that children can easily follow, and focused on action and emotion rather than historical detail or moral complexity. The woman telling the story doesn't know she's preserving something ancient. For her, this is just a story her grandmother told her, which that grandmother learned from her grandmother, going back through time in an unbroken chain. The chain has thinned. Each link holds less than the one before, but it hasn't broken. You hear fragments of other old stories in different contexts. A farmer mentions a proverb about cattle, and you recognize it as a line from a legal precedent you once heard recited in full. A craftsman tells a brief anecdote about a clever trick, and you realize it's a condensed version of a 30-minute story about a culture hero's cunning. The stories have scattered and simplified, but they haven't died. They've changed form, moving from the controlled custody of trained specialists to the messy democracy of folk tradition, where anyone can tell them, and every telling is different, and the standards are entertainment and emotional truth rather than historical accuracy or formal perfection. You also notice new stories emerging and oral traditions being created in real time. There's a story going around about a local hero who defended the village against bandits 20 years ago. You were there. You know what actually happened, and the story is already becoming exaggerated, already accumulating mythological elements. The hero is getting braver, the bandits more numerous, and the victory more decisive. This is oral tradition creating itself, the same process that created the ancient stories, still active, still working. Humans apparently can't help but mythologize their own history, shape their memories into narratives, and turn lived experience into stories that mean something beyond bare fact. Some elements of bardic tradition have been surprisingly durable. The importance of genealogy persists. People still care about lineage and still remember their ancestors' names going back several generations, even though there's no professional class of bards keeping the comprehensive genealogies anymore. The connection between story and place remains strong. That boulder where Finan made his stand, People still know the story and still point it out to travelers, even though the story has lost most of its detail and nobody's quite sure anymore when Finan lived or even if he was real. Music and storytelling are still intertwined. The old formal structures are mostly gone. Nobody's composing in the strict meters that trained bards used, but people still sing stories, still use rhythm and repetition to make narratives memorable, and still understand that performance is part of what makes a story live. And satire is alive and well, perhaps more vigorous than ever. Without formal bards to regulate social behavior through praise and blame, the community has taken on that function itself. Gossip serves some of the same purposes satire once did, keeping people honest, puncturing pretension, and maintaining social norms through the power of reputation and ridicule. You meet an old man who was briefly apprenticed to a bard in his youth before the bardic schools disappeared. He didn't complete his training, the school closed, his teacher died, and he had to find other work, but he still remembers fragments of what he learned. He recites a genealogy for you, going back 12 generations, and you can tell from the rhythm and formal language that this is authentic bardic material, preserved in his memory for 50 years, even though he never completed his training. He's the last person in the village who knows this genealogy in the proper form, and he's painfully aware that when he dies, that formal knowledge dies with him. But his grandchildren know a simplified version, just the most recent few generations, and they'll pass that on to their children. The continuity persists, even in degraded form. You spend an evening listening to people share stories around a fire, and you're struck by how much this looks like the old hall gatherings, even though nobody here is a trained bard. Humans apparently have an innate need to tell stories, to share narratives, and to make sense of their experience through structured retelling. The professional bardic tradition may be gone, but the impulse it served remains. An old story survives if it continues to do useful work, if it entertains or teaches or binds the community or helps people make sense of their world. The stories that stopped being useful have mostly faded, but the ones that still serve human needs persist, adapted to new contexts, but recognizably continuous with their ancient sources. You're sitting quietly by a fire, much like the one at the very beginning, thinking about what's been lost and what remains. The professional bards are gone, victims of historical change, cultural transformation, and the spread of literacy. The vast memorized libraries they carried in their heads have mostly vanished. The formal training systems, the precise standards, and the sophisticated oral technologies all disappeared. But stories remain, simplified, fragmented, transformed, but not dead. They've found new vessels and new modes of transmission. They've adapted to survive, sacrificing precision for accessibility and complexity for resilience. The specific stories of minor cattle raids and local disputes, those are mostly gone. But the major narratives, the tales that spoke to something universal in human experience, have survived in folklore, in written collections made by antiquarians, and in the living tradition of storytellers who may not know they're part of an ancient lineage. When you hear someone tell a fairy tale, you're hearing the echo of bardic tradition. When someone sings an old ballad, you're hearing rhythms and structures and narrative patterns developed over centuries of oral performance. When a grandparent tells a grandchild a story that begins, "Long ago, in the days of your ancestors," that's the bardic impulse still alive, still doing its work of connecting past to present, individual to community, and lived experience to meaningful narrative. The Celtic peoples eventually did start writing their stories down. Medieval monks preserved some of the old tales in manuscripts that still exist today, but what they preserved was already transformed, already adapted to fit new contexts and new worldviews. The original oral performances, with all their spontaneity and responsiveness, and living flexibility are gone beyond recovery. You can read the words, but you can't hear the voice. You can study the structure, but you can't feel the relationship between performer and audience. You can analyze the content, but you can't experience the way the story changed slightly each time it was told, adapting to who needed to hear it and what they needed to hear. That's the paradox of oral tradition. Its strength, its flexibility, its living quality is also its vulnerability. The stories that best served their communities adapted so well to changing times that they eventually adapted beyond recognition. The stories that stubbornly resisted change got preserved more accurately, but often at the cost of relevance and survival. You think about all those bards you've watched over the years, the apprentices building memory palaces, the professionals performing for chiefs, the traveling storytellers working for their supper, the satirists keeping communities honest, the legal experts settling disputes, and the music makers weaving narrative and melody together. They're gone, but what they did, the fundamental human work of preserving and transmitting culture through memory and performance, that work continues. The methods have changed, the standards are different, but the impulse remains constant. Humans need stories, need to remember where they came from, need to make sense of their experience through narrative, and need to pass wisdom forward to the next generation. The fire burns low, and you stir it back to life, adding another piece of peat. The flames rise, throwing shadows on the walls, and you imagine for a moment that you can see them, all those bards, all those stories, all that accumulated wisdom that lived nowhere but in the memories of dedicated people who made it their life's work to remember. Most of what they knew is lost, but not all, not quite all. The stories that never got written down aren't entirely gone. They live in fragments, in echoes, in the DNA of every story told orally today. They live in the folk traditions that still exist. They live in the written collections that captured at least the verbal content, if not the full living performance. And they live in the ongoing human practice of storytelling itself, in every parent telling a child a bedtime story, in every friend recounting a funny incident, and in every community maintaining its own narrative about who it is and where it came from. The bards are gone, but the bardic impulse remains, and will always remain as long as humans need to make meaning through narrative, to connect through shared story, and to remember together what matters most. The fire settles, the night deepens, and somewhere, someone is telling a story, keeping something alive, passing something forward, continuing the work that those ancient bards began thousands of years ago in halls, much like this one, by fires, much like this one, to audiences who came for entertainment, but received something more essential, the gift of being connected to something larger than themselves, to a tradition that stretches back to the beginning and forward to whatever comes next. The smoke curls upward through the thatch. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns, and the stories continue, taking new forms, serving new purposes, but essentially unchanged in their deepest function, helping humans understand themselves and each other, helping communities cohere and cultures persist, and helping meaning survive, even when everything else is lost. That's what remains. Not the specific words, those are mostly gone. Not the formal structures, those have dissolved. But the underlying truth is that stories matter, that memory matters, that the work of preserving and transmitting what's important is work worth doing, work that makes us human. The night grows late, and it's time to sleep, to rest and dream. And perhaps in dreams, you'll hear them still. Those ancient voices, those skilled performers, those living libraries, telling their stories into the darkness, keeping the culture alive one tale at a time, trusting in memory and in the deep human need to remember together. Sleep now. The stories will still be there in the morning, changed but continuous, simplified but not dead, waiting to be told again, waiting to do their work of binding past to present, self to community, and meaning to experience. Sleep and remember and dream of voices that still echo, however faintly, across the centuries. You stand at the edge of a vast oak forest in what will one day be called Gaul, though no one here knows that name yet. The year is somewhere around 500 BCE, and the concept of recording this date would seem as strange to the people around you as trying to capture smoke in your hands. There are no books here, no scrolls, no carved stone proclamations declaring the deeds of kings. Knowledge exists only in the minds of those who remember, passed from breath to breath, from one generation's lips to the next generation's ears. The morning mist hasn't fully lifted from the valley, and you can smell the wood smoke from the roundhouses scattered across the hillside. Each dwelling is a marvel of practical engineering. Circular walls of wattle and daub, thatched roofs that shed rain like a duck's back, and doorways that always face east to greet the sun. The people who emerge from these homes move with the purposeful slowness of those who measure time by seasons rather than hours. There are no clocks here, no appointments to keep, and no schedules written in ink that might fade. In the center of the settlement, you notice a young man sitting cross-legged on a flat stone, his eyes closed, his lips moving silently. He's perhaps 14 or 15, at that awkward age where his limbs seem too long for his body. His name is Carantus, though you won't need to remember it. What matters is what he's doing, memorizing the lineage of his tribe's chieftain, going back 12 generations. He's been at it since dawn, repeating the names like a prayer. Vercingetorix, son of Divitiacus, son of Caturix, son of Ambiorix, and on, each name a link in a chain that connects the present to the shadowy past. You might wonder why anyone would bother with such an exercise when they could simply write it down. But the Celtic peoples of this time don't trust writing for important matters. They've seen Greek and Phoenician traders scratching symbols onto tablets, and they find the practice vaguely unsettling. How can something as alive as a person's name, with all its spoken music and breath, be reduced to dead marks on a surface? It seems almost disrespectful, like trying to preserve a thunderstorm in a jar. Besides, memory is a muscle, and in this world, it's the strongest muscle many people possess. The elderly woman grinding grain near the communal oven can recite every plant that grows within a day's walk and its use, which ones heal fevers, which ones ease childbirth, and which ones send you into dreams from which you never wake. The blacksmith hammering bronze into an intricate torque can tell you the precise composition of his alloy, passed down from his grandfather's grandfather, not in measurements, but in colors and sounds, the way the metal sings when it's ready, and the shade of orange that means the fire is hot enough. In this pre-literate world, your status isn't determined by how many scrolls you own or how many languages you can read. It's measured by what you can remember, what you can recite, and what you carry inside your head. And into this world, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new kind of person is emerging. Someone who doesn't just remember practical things like genealogies and plant lore, but who has begun to remember everything. Abstract ideas, legal precedents, the movements of stars, the nature of the soul, poetry that takes 3 days to recite properly. These people don't call themselves druids yet. That word will come later, probably derived from the roots for oak and knowledge. though etymology becomes fuzzy when languages are only spoken, never frozen in writing. Right now, they're simply the ones who know things, the ones you go to when you need to settle a dispute, or understand why the crops failed, or learn the proper way to honor the gods. You watch as Carantus finally opens his eyes, blinking in the strengthening sunlight. He's finished his recitation, and his mentor, an older man with silver threading through his dark hair, nods approval. The boy hasn't become a druid yet. He's barely begun. But he's taken the first step into a tradition that will, over the next few centuries, create the most sophisticated oral education system the ancient world has ever known. The settlement is waking up properly now. Children chase each other between the houses, their laughter sharp and bright in the morning air. A few dogs, lean and rangy, nose around for scraps. Someone is singing while they work, a tune without words that seems to mimic the pattern of whatever task they're performing. The rhythm of this place is different from what you're used to. Slower, more circular, returning always to familiar patterns like a spiral carved into stone. You notice that the silver-haired mentor has placed his hand on Carantus's shoulder and is leading him toward the edge of the settlement, where the forest begins in earnest. This is where the real education happens, not in any building, not at any desk, but walking through the woods, learning to read the landscape itself as if it were a book, which, in a sense, it is, the only book that matters. The forest swallows you in green shadow. Oak trees, ancient and thick-trunked, rise like pillars in a natural cathedral. Their branches interweave overhead, filtering the sunlight into a golden-green glow that makes everything feel slightly unreal, as if you've stepped sideways into a different world. Perhaps you have. The older man, his name is Segomaros, and he's been a druid for 30 years, walks with the careful pace of someone who notices everything. He pauses to examine a particular moss growing on the north side of a tree. He crouches to inspect a mushroom, then moves on without touching it. Young Carantus follows a few steps behind, trying to walk quietly, though fallen leaves crunch under his feet, no matter how carefully he places them. You learn, as you follow them deeper into the woods, that becoming a druid is nothing like any education system you've encountered before. There are no terms or semesters, no graduation ceremonies. Some students study for 20 years. A few exceptionally talented ones might complete their training in 12. Most who begin never finish at all, returning to their tribes to become skilled craftspeople or warriors or farmers, carrying with them a deeper knowledge than they started with, but not the full weight of druidic learning. Segomaros begins to speak, and you realize this is how it's done. Not lectures exactly, more like conversations with long pauses built in, spaces for the student to think, to question, to absorb. The first thing you must understand, he says, his voice low and measured, is that we are the memory of our people. Not just their past, but their present understanding of how the world works. When I die, everything I know dies with me, unless I've placed it safely in your mind and the minds of your fellow students. It's a sobering thought. No backup copies, no libraries to consult, just the fragile vessel of human memory, which can be destroyed by a fever or a blow to the head or the simple erosion of age. They continue walking, and Segomaros points out a clearing where 5 paths meet. This is where we settled a boundary dispute last spring, he says. 2 families, both claiming the same grazing land, both with reasonable arguments. I'll tell you the case, and you'll remember it. Not just the outcome, but the reasoning. Because when a similar dispute arises 30 years from now, you'll need to recall how we thought through the problem. And so begins a recitation that takes most of an hour. The dispute itself wasn't particularly dramatic. No violence, no shouting, just two stubborn farmers convinced they were right. But the way Segomaros walked through the logic, considering ancient precedents, examining the land itself for clues about old boundaries, consulting the memories of the eldest tribal members, it was like watching someone solve an intricate puzzle where every piece was made of words and memory. Carantus listens with an intensity that makes his eyes water from not blinking enough. You can almost see him filing away each detail, creating mental hooks to hang the information on. The Druids, you realize, have developed elaborate memory techniques, associating facts with physical locations, creating vivid mental images, and using rhythm and rhyme to make information sticky in the mind. Later cultures will rediscover these methods and give them fancy names like method of loci. But here in the forest, they're simply the way knowledge is preserved. Days blur into weeks, and you watch the pattern of education unfold. There's no single subject that Carantus studies. Instead, everything is interconnected. A lesson about oak trees becomes a lesson about the sacred nature of certain groves, which becomes a lesson about proper ritual behavior, which becomes a lesson about the structure of the cosmos itself. The Druids see no separation between what you might call science, religion, law, and philosophy. It's all one vast web of understanding, and a true Druid must hold the entire web in their mind. You're present one afternoon when Segomaros tests Carantus on plant identification. They're sitting beside a stream, and the older Druid points to various growing things, asking for names and uses. Carantus does well with the common ones: the herbs for cooking, the plants for healing minor wounds. But then Segomaros points to a small, unremarkable plant with oval leaves. And this one. Carantus hesitates. You can see him searching his memory, trying to recall. Finally, he admits he doesn't know. Instead of scolding, Segomaros simply says, "Look at it. Really look. What does it tell you about itself?" The boy stares at the plant for a long time. He touches its leaves gently, feels their texture. He smells them. He examines where it's growing, in partial shade, near water, in soil that's neither too wet nor too dry. It's careful, he finally says. It doesn't want too much of anything. Balance. Segomaros smiles. The first time you've seen him show open pleasure in his students' progress. Yes, this is Salago. We use it for protection, for cleansing. But you've understood something more important, that every plant teaches you about the nature of existence itself. Balance, moderation, finding your right place in the world. This, you realize, is the heart of Druidic education. It's not just about accumulating facts, though the Druids accumulate a staggering number of facts. It's about developing a particular way of seeing the world, where everything is connected to everything else, where the small reflects the large, and where the same patterns repeat at every scale, from the growth of an acorn to the movement of the stars. The education happens everywhere, sometimes in the forest, sometimes at tribal gatherings, sometimes during the long winter nights when stories are shared around the fire. Carantus learns poetry, not simple songs, but elaborate compositions that can take hours to recite, filled with complex metaphors and layered meanings. He learns genealogy, not just of his own tribe, but of neighboring tribes, of legendary heroes, and of the gods themselves. He learns the calendar, how to predict the phases of the moon, when to expect the return of certain birds, and which days are favorable for important undertakings. And always, woven through everything, he learns the law. The Druids are the legal experts of their society, the walking repositories of precedent and tradition. They can recite hundreds of judgments and thousands of specific rulings, all organized in their minds through elaborate mnemonic systems. When Carantus is older, people will come to him with disputes, and he'll need to summon up the relevant cases instantly, without fumbling, without uncertainty. You watch one evening as Segomaros introduces Carantus to something new, the triad, a teaching device the druids love. Everything, Segomaros explains, can be understood in threes. There are three foundations of wisdom: knowledge of the past, understanding of the present, and vision of the future. There are three qualities of a good judge: patience, impartiality, and memory. There are three dangers to learning: arrogance, haste, and distraction. The triads go on and on, hundreds of them, each one a nugget of wisdom compressed into an easily remembered form. Carantus will spend years memorizing these until he can produce the appropriate triad for any situation, any question, any problem that arises. As the seasons turn, you notice something interesting. Carantus isn't becoming duller from all this memorization, as you might expect. His mind is becoming sharper, more agile, and more capable of holding multiple ideas at once and seeing the connections between them. His memory is developing into something almost superhuman, able to recall conversations word for word from months ago and to summon up precise details of events he witnessed only once. This is what it means to become a druid, to transform your mind into a library, a courthouse, and a university, all wrapped in a single human skull. It's an enormous undertaking, and now you understand why most students don't complete it. The mental discipline required is extraordinary, maintained year after year, with no end in sight except the day when you're finally acknowledged as a full druid and can begin teaching students of your own. 10 years have passed, though you've barely noticed the time flowing by. Carantus is no longer a gangly teenager, but a man in his mid-20s, still studying, but now taking on more responsibilities. You find yourself at a tribal gathering, a massive assembly that happens 4 times a year when the moon is right and the weather permits. Hundreds of people have congregated in a natural amphitheater formed by a hillside. Families have traveled for days to be here, bringing disputes that need settling, questions that need answering, and grievances that require the wisdom of the druids. The gathering serves many purposes: social connection, religious observance, trade, and barter, but the most important function is judicial. You watch as Segomaros, now even more silver-haired than before, takes his place on a raised platform of earth. He's not alone. 6 other druids are with him, ranging in age from barely older than Carantus to a woman so ancient her face looks like weathered oak bark. They represent different tribes and different territories, but they all share the same training and the same vast body of memorized lore. The first case of the day involves a borrowed cow. A farmer claims his neighbor never returned the animal. The neighbor insists he did return it, but it wandered off before the first farmer saw it back in his field. It's the sort of petty dispute that could escalate into a blood feud if not handled properly. Both men state their cases, speaking clearly and without interruption. The druids listen with perfect attention, their faces neutral. When both sides are finished, Segomaros doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he closes his eyes for a long moment, searching his memory for relevant precedents. Then, he begins to speak. His voice carries across the hillside without shouting. He's trained for this and knows how to project without strain. In the time of our grandfathers' grandfathers, he begins, a similar case arose between 2 families of the Arverni. A borrowed horse, not a cow, but the principle remains the same. The druid Divisiacus ruled thus: When an animal is returned to common grazing land, rather than to an enclosed field, the responsibility for its safety passes back to the lender at the moment the borrower releases it in that place. However, the borrower must demonstrate that the return happened during daylight hours, when the lender could reasonably have seen the animal. He opens his eyes and looks at the two farmers. "Can you show that you returned the cow during daylight?" The borrower hesitates. "It was evening, near dusk." Then the loss falls upon you. You should have kept the animal until morning or returned it directly to your neighbor's enclosure. The cow's value will be paid in kind, a heifer of equivalent age and quality, delivered before the next moon. The ruling is accepted without argument. This is the power of the Druids. Their judgments carry weight, not because they're backed by force, but because everyone trusts in the vast accumulation of precedent and wisdom they represent. To argue with a Druid's ruling would be to argue with the collected experience of generations. Case after case unfolds throughout the day. A boundary dispute that requires Segamaros to recite the exact wording of an agreement made 40 years ago, which he does without hesitation. A question of inheritance complicated by a second marriage and children from both unions. An accusation of theft that requires careful examination of the accused person's character and history. You notice something remarkable about how the Druids work. They don't rely on written evidence because there isn't any, but they're not helpless without it. Instead, they call upon witnesses, examine the consistency of stories, and look for corroborating details. They understand human nature deeply, how people lie, how they rationalize, and how they remember events differently based on their own interests. Carantus sits slightly apart from the senior Druids, observing everything. His role today is to remember these cases, to add them to the vast mental archive he's building. Years from now, he'll cite these very judgments when making his own rulings. Between cases, you notice the Druids consulting with each other quietly. They're checking each other's memories, making sure important details haven't been forgotten or misremembered. This is another safeguard in their system. The law isn't held by a single person, but by the collective memory of the Druidic class. If one Druid is uncertain about a precedent, another can confirm or correct it. As the sun begins to sink toward the horizon, a more serious case comes before the assembly. A man has been accused of murder, not in hot blood during a fight, which would be serious enough, but through poison, which is considered particularly dishonorable. The accused maintains his innocence. There are no witnesses to the actual poisoning, only the suspicious death and some circumstantial evidence. The woman with the face like oak bark takes the lead on this case. Her voice is thin and reedy, but everyone strains to hear every word. She questions both the accuser and the accused with surgical precision, teasing out details, looking for inconsistencies. She asks about the victim's other enemies, about who would benefit from his death, about the type of poison suspected, and about who would have access to it. Finally, after what feels like hours, she pronounces her judgment. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. However, there are ways to determine truth when human testimony fails us. She looks at the accused man with eyes that seem to see right through him. You will undergo the ordeal of the sacred pool. If the gods find you innocent, the water will support you. If guilty, it will reject you. You feel a chill run down your spine. This is the other side of Druidic authority, their connection to the divine, their ability to call upon supernatural means of judgment when natural ones fall short. The accused man pales, but nods acceptance. To refuse would be to admit guilt in everyone's eyes. The actual ordeal will take place tomorrow, giving everyone time to prepare properly and to make the necessary offerings and prayers. But the Druid's word is already final. Whatever the outcome of the ordeal, it will be accepted as the truth revealed by higher powers. As the gathering disperses for the evening meal, you overhear conversations among the common people. They're not afraid of the Druids exactly, but they treat them with a respect that borders on reverence. The Druids are the ones who keep society functioning, who prevent disputes from becoming feuds, and who maintain the delicate balance of justice that allows different families and tribes to coexist without constant violence. Later, around the fire, you sit near enough to hear Segamaros speaking with Carantus about the day's cases. "You saw how Moriana handled the murder accusation?" he asks his student. Carantus nods. She admitted the limits of human knowledge. She knew when to call upon the gods. Exactly. We are wise, but we are not all-knowing. The hardest part of being a druid is knowing when you've reached the boundary of what logic and memory can determine. That's when ritual and divine judgment become necessary. He pokes at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. But never use the gods as a shortcut. Some druids, lazy ones, call for ordeals when a little more questioning would reveal the truth. The gods have their own business to attend to. We shouldn't bother them with matters we can sort out ourselves. It's a fascinating glimpse into the druidic worldview, simultaneously deeply religious and surprisingly practical. The druids believe absolutely in the reality of the gods and the spirit world, but they don't use that belief as an excuse for sloppy thinking. If anything, their connection to the divine seems to make them more rigorous in their reasoning, not less. The fire burns low, and people begin drifting toward their temporary shelters. Tomorrow will bring more cases, more judgments, and more demonstrations of the Druids' role as the living law of their people. But for now, there's only the quiet crackle of cooling embers and the stars wheeling overhead in patterns the Druids have memorized as thoroughly as they've memorized everything else. Years continue to accumulate like fallen leaves. Carantus is now fully recognized as a druid in his own right, though still considered young at 35. You follow him on a journey to a sacred grove deep in territory controlled by the Carnutes tribe in the very heart of Gaul. This grove, it's whispered, is the center of the druidic world, where the most important gatherings take place and the deepest mysteries are contemplated. The journey takes weeks of walking through forests and across rivers, staying with various tribes along the way. Each time Carantus is recognized as a druid, he's treated as an honored guest, given the best food, and given the warmest spot by the fire. But he never takes advantage of this hospitality. You notice he's scrupulously fair in his dealings, careful not to favor one family over another, mindful that his presence alone can shift the dynamics of a community. The sacred grove, when you finally reach it, is nothing like you expected. There's no grand architecture, no monuments, just a clearing among ancient oaks, their trunks so massive it would take 4 people linking hands to encircle one. The ground is covered in thick moss that muffles footsteps. A spring bubbles up from rocks at one edge, its water clear and cold. Dozens of druids have gathered here from across the Celtic world. They've come from Britannia and Hibernia to the west, from as far south as the lands near the Middle Sea, and from the eastern territories where Celtic and Germanic tribes mix and blur. Despite their different origins, they can all understand each other, not just because they speak related languages, but because they share the same training, the same body of knowledge, and the same ways of thinking about the world. You settle in to observe what happens over the next several days. There are discussions, debates, and exchanges of information. A druid from Britannia shares astronomical observations made over the past year. One from Hibernia recites a newly composed poem about the death and rebirth of the sun god. An elderly druid from the south shares legal precedents from his region, which the others memorize and discuss, considering whether to adopt them in their own territories. But the deepest conversations happen in small groups, with druids sitting in circles of 3 or 4, talking about the nature of reality itself. You position yourself near Carantus and 2 other druids around his age, listening as they explore questions that have no easy answers. One of them, a woman named Visucia with sharp eyes and quick gestures, poses a question. If the soul is immortal and passes from one life to another, as we teach, then what is the purpose of virtue? Why should we concern ourselves with justice and honor in this life if we'll simply be reborn into another? Carantus considers this carefully before responding. Perhaps the question assumes wrongly that virtue is only valuable if it earns us something beyond itself. A tree doesn't produce acorns in order to achieve immortality. It simply does what a tree does. Maybe humans should practice justice because that's what humans do when they're truly themselves, not because it leads to reward. The third druid, a man named Maggiorix, shakes his head. But trees don't have a choice. We do. And choice implies purpose and direction. I think the soul carries the imprint of its deeds from one life to the next. Act with honor now, and you'll be born into circumstances that reflect that honor. Act with cruelty, and you'll find yourself in a life shaped by that cruelty. The conversation continues for hours, weaving through questions of fate and free will, the nature of the gods, and the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds. What strikes you most is the lack of dogma. The druids don't have a fixed scripture they must defend. Instead, they approach these questions like explorers mapping unknown territory, using reason and observation and intuition to feel their way toward understanding. You learn, as you listen to multiple such conversations over several days, that the druids have developed a sophisticated philosophy of nature. They see the cosmos as fundamentally alive, animated by the same force that moves through humans and animals and plants. Everything is connected in a vast web of relationships. The health of the land affects the health of the people. The actions of the people affect the land. The gods are not separate from nature, but a nature itself expressing intelligence and will. This philosophy has practical implications. When a druid advises a tribe about where to plant crops or when to move cattle to new pastures, they're not just applying agricultural knowledge. They're thinking about the whole system, the soil, the water, the weather patterns, the needs of wild animals, and the spiritual significance of particular locations. It's a holistic approach that you suspect is often more effective than the narrow focus of specialists. One evening, as the sun sets and long shadows stretch across the grove, the oldest druid present, a man so ancient no one can remember when he wasn't old, begins to speak about the nature of time. His voice is barely above a whisper, but in the stillness of the grove, everyone can hear. Time is not a river, he says. That's what the Romans think, with their calendars and their history books. Time is a spiral, always returning but never quite the same. The seasons repeat, but each spring is different from the last spring. We celebrate the same festivals our ancestors celebrated, but we are not our ancestors. We carry their memories, we speak their language, we honor their gods, but we are ourselves, here, now, in this particular turning of the spiral. He pauses, and in the silence, you can hear the spring trickling and a bird calling from the darkening forest. This is why we don't write things down, he continues. Writing tries to fix time, to make it stand still. But time can't stand still. Knowledge must be alive and must change and grow with each person who holds it. When I teach you something, I don't give you dead words on a page. I give you living words that will change inside you, that you'll understand differently at 40 than you did at 20, differently at 60 than you did at 40. It's a beautiful articulation of something you've been sensing throughout your time among the Druids. Their entire system is based on the idea that knowledge is not a thing to possess, but a living process to participate in. Each Druid is not just a container of information, but an active interpreter, constantly reweaving the threads of tradition into patterns that make sense for their particular time and place. The gathering in the sacred grove lasts for 3 full cycles of the moon. During this time, the Druids make collective decisions about important matters. They agree on adjustments to the calendar. They discuss whether certain new legal precedents should be adopted widely. They compose poetry together, with different Druids contributing verses, the whole thing memorized by everyone present so they can carry it back to their home territories. You realize this is how the Druidic class maintains coherence across vast distances. These periodic gatherings allow them to synchronize their knowledge, to ensure that a Druid in Britannia and a Druid in Gaul are working from roughly the same foundation of law and custom and wisdom. It's an elegant solution to a problem that literate societies solve with written codes and libraries. How to maintain consistency of knowledge when you're spread across an entire continent. As the gathering finally disperses and Druids begin their journeys home, you notice an atmosphere of quiet satisfaction. They've done their work. They've strengthened the bonds of their shared tradition. They've passed on knowledge and received knowledge in return. And now they'll carry all of it in their heads back to their people, the living libraries returning to their shelves. The wheel of time keeps turning, but you've stopped paying close attention to its revolutions. Decades have blurred past. Carantus is now an old man, white-bearded and stiff in his movements. The world has been changing around him in ways both subtle and dramatic. Roman influence has been creeping northward like frost, not through military conquest yet, but through trade and cultural exchange. You've seen Roman merchants in Celtic settlements, their short tunics and clean-shaven faces standing out among the mustached warriors in their trousers and cloaks. They bring wine and olive oil and pottery, and they take away tin and gold and slaves. They also bring something else, the written word carved into stone and scratched onto wax tablets, a technology that both fascinates and disturbs the Celtic peoples who encounter it. Some younger Druids have learned to read and write Latin, though they keep this skill quiet, aware that it goes against Druidic tradition. The prohibition against writing sacred knowledge remains firm, but you can sense it weakening at the edges. The world is becoming more complex. The network of tribes and alliances harder to keep straight without records. Some Druids are beginning to wonder whether the old ways can survive contact with Roman civilization. You're with Carantus one afternoon when a delegation arrives from a neighboring tribe. They've brought a legal dispute so complex, it's taken 3 of them to explain all the relevant facts. It involves a marriage, an inheritance, a broken contract, an accusation of fraud, and a counterclaim of slander. The threads of the case are so tangled that just understanding the question takes most of the day. Carantus listens with the patience of long practice, occasionally asking questions to clarify a point. Then he sits in silence for what feels like an hour, his eyes closed, sorting through the vast archive of precedents in his mind. When he finally speaks, his judgment is clear and detailed, citing cases from 50 years ago, 70 years ago, and even one from his teacher's time that seems remarkably relevant. The delegation accepts his ruling with obvious relief. As they're leaving, one of them, a young warrior with bright, curious eyes, asks Carantus something you haven't heard before. Honored Druid, the Romans have libraries where all their laws are written down. Anyone can read them. Anyone can know what the law says. Why don't we do the same? Wouldn't it be easier? Carantus regards the young man with an expression that might be sadness or might be amusement. "Come walk with me," he says, and leads the warrior away from the settlement into the hills where the evening light is turning everything golden. You follow at a distance, just close enough to hear their conversation. "You ask about the Roman way," Carantus begins. "They write everything down. This is true. But what happens when the words on the page don't quite fit the situation at hand? The Romans have judges who interpret the written law, but those interpretations become rigid and fixed. Our way is different. Every case I judge, I bring to bear not just the letter of our traditions, but the spirit of them. I can weigh circumstances, consider intentions, and make adjustments based on what serves justice rather than what serves the written word." They walk in silence for a while. Then Carantus continues. "More than that, writing changes how we think. When knowledge is written down, it becomes separate from the knower. It's out there, on the page, dead and unchanging. But when knowledge lives in memory, it stays alive. It grows. It adapts. Each time I recite a law or a precedent, I make it new again. I put my understanding into it. The law isn't just words. It's a living tradition that breathes through those of us who carry it." The young warrior seems to be struggling with this concept. "But what happens when you die? Won't all your knowledge die with you?" "Of course not," Carantus replies gently. "I have students, as my teacher had students. They're memorizing everything I know, just as I memorized everything my teachers knew. Some of it will be lost in the transfer. That's inevitable. But some of it will be improved, refined, and added to. The tradition will continue, but it will also evolve. This is how it should be." They've reached a high point overlooking the valley, and they stand there watching the sun sink toward the horizon. You can see smoke rising from a dozen settlements scattered across the landscape, each one a small cluster of round houses where people live and work and dream, largely unchanged from how they lived generations ago. But you know that this world is ending. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but soon. The Romans are coming, and not just as traders. Their legions are already conquering territories to the south and east. Within a generation, much of the Celtic world will be absorbed into the Roman Empire. The Druids will be persecuted, their groves cut down, and their traditions suppressed. The oral knowledge they've preserved for centuries will be scattered, and much of it will be lost forever. Yet standing here in the evening light, listening to Carantus explain the philosophy behind his life's work, you understand that something important did happen here. For several centuries, an entire civilization functioned without writing, developing sophisticated systems of law and education and philosophy entirely through the power of human memory. The Druids proved that literacy isn't the only path to complex thought, that oral cultures can achieve depths of understanding that rival anything written down. Years pass, and you're still with Carantus when the end finally comes. Roman legions under Julius Caesar have invaded Gaul, and they're methodically crushing all resistance. Caesar's soldiers have orders to kill Druids on sight. He understands that they're the glue holding Celtic society together, and removing them will make conquest easier. Carantus is too old to run, and besides, he wouldn't if he could. On his last day, he gathers his students around him in a grove that hasn't yet been found by Roman soldiers. There are 5 of them, ranging in age from 20 to 40, each one carrying in their head a portion of the vast knowledge Carantus has accumulated over his lifetime. "Listen carefully," he tells them, his voice weaker than it once was, but still clear. "What we've preserved will not survive unchanged. The Romans will try to destroy it, and they'll succeed in destroying much. But memory is harder to kill than they imagine. Our language will change. Our gods will be given Roman names. Our laws will be mixed with Roman law, but something will remain. He looks at each student in turn. Some of you will survive by hiding who you are. You'll become advisors to Roman governors and teachers in Roman schools. You'll seem to assimilate. But inside, you'll carry these traditions forward. Your children will hear the old stories. Your students will learn the old ways of thinking, even if they don't know that's what they're learning. It's the last teaching any of them receive from him. The next day, Roman soldiers find the grove. But by then, the students have scattered, each carrying with them fragments of a tradition that will, against all odds, survive in hidden forms, in folk practices, in story and song, and in ways of thinking about the natural world that persist long after the Druids themselves are gone. You drift forward through time one last time, to a period after the Druids, after the Romans, after empires have risen and fallen and been forgotten. You find yourself in a medieval monastery in Ireland, watching a monk carefully copying an old manuscript. The manuscript contains stories about ancient heroes and gods, tales that were once memorized by Druids and passed down through generations before finally being written down. The monk doesn't know he's preserving Druidic tradition. He thinks he's just recording interesting old stories. But in those stories, embedded like seeds in amber, are ways of thinking about the world that the Druids would recognize, the interconnection of all things, the spiral nature of time, and the wisdom found in wild places. You realize this is the legacy, not grand monuments or written texts, but ideas that seeped into the culture so deeply they became invisible, assumed, simply the way people thought. The Druids shaped the imagination of Europe in ways that are impossible to quantify, teaching people to see forests as sacred, to value memory and oral tradition, and to understand that knowledge isn't just facts, but wisdom lived and breathed. As you watch the monk work, his quill scratching across parchment in a quiet scriptorium, you feel yourself beginning to drift. The weight of sleep is pulling at you, soft and insistent. The candle on the monk's desk flickers, and the shadows on the walls seem to dance with patterns you almost recognize. Spirals and circles, the geometry of Celtic art, the visual language of a people who knew that some truths can't be written down, but must be experienced, remembered, and carried in the heart. The candle dims further. The scratching of the quill fades to silence, and you slip finally into sleep, carrying with you the memory of a world where knowledge lived only in minds, where wisdom was passed from breath to breath, where the keepers of tradition walked through oak forests, memorizing the laws of earth and sky. The slow, steady rhythm of Druids becoming, being, enduring in ways both lost and found, forgotten and remembered, as eternal as memory itself.